Welcome to the Stocks on the Rock Show. Whether you like it neat, on the rocks, chilled, or warm, everybody's happier when there's money in their account and a drink in their glass. Let's get started. On today's episode, we put a re-dram of Basil Hayden's. Okay, that's a terrible accent, but today we're doing Basil Hayden's, and we're talking about an old classic, maybe the biggest, oldest stock. We'll call it the granddaddy of them all, IBM. Hey, welcome to Stocks on the Rocks. Hope you guys are having an amazing weekend. I think that is a good opportunity to talk about Basil Hayden's as an opportunity to introduce people to the delicious world of bourbon. You know, and I bring this one up because just this week I was actually in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. And I ran into a very good friend of mine. And he and I have been friends since quite literally I was 17 years old. He and I have been friends since we were 17. We worked together. Our first job, get this, my first job was at McDonald's, working on the wall, making burgers and making filet of fish sandwiches. And my buddy Larry was there right with me. So Larry and I were out this weekend, and he said, you know, I don't know that I like bourbon. So I said, you know, I got to get you a good starter bourbon. And a good starter bourbon is Basil Hayden's or Basil Hayden's. I'm not sure exactly what the pronunciation is. I've heard both, but Basil Hayden's is one that's very readily accessible. It is from the Jim Beam distillery set. So Jim Beam bought some smaller distillers, Bakers, Bookers, some of those. And what it does is it gives you a good entry-level bourbon. Now, price point, it's an 80 proof. So 80 proof, it's a little bit lower on the Richter scale, if you will. Its price point is around 40, can be, as I've seen it, as high as $50 a bottle. So it does have a little bit of a higher price point to it. Once in a great while, you can find it on sale for the high 30s, but it's a slightly higher price point bourbon, but it's a really good entry-level bourbon. If you're having a bourbon night and someone's coming over and they normally drink cocktails or they normally do just beer and they've not really done bourbon, this is a really, really simple and easy one to do. Now, a little bit of the story of this one. This has been distilled, if you will, since 1796. And Mr. Basil Hayden, he came from Baltimore, Maryland to Kentucky. Now in Baltimore, they didn't do a lot of corn distilling, so he brought what they did in Baltimore, which was rye distilling. So the rye distilling that he brought, I'm sure that the bourbon purists were freaking out, losing their minds, because it wasn't all corn. Well, this has a very high rye content. So you do get a little bit more, when you think of bourbon, the corn is a bit more sweet and mellow, the rye is a bit more spicy. So one of the things I do like about Basil Hayden's is that you do get that taste of rye in the back. So immediately, I've just opened the bottle, by the way. This is a brand new one. Immediately when you open the bottle, you get the smell of almost like a black tea. I almost get like a black tea right up front. So I think that there's a black tea, maybe even a little bit of a peppermint or a mint kind of flavor to it. So that kind of opens it, you know, from the bottle, right? When you give it a little pour, it's a fairly light in color, but remember, it's only 80 proof, so they've cut this one pretty good. And just think about it, when it's 80 proof, it really just means they added more water, right? A barrel strength is that we didn't add any water coming out of it. We didn't necessarily need to. 80 proof means we're able to cut it a little bit more. Yeah, so in the glass, you really get that strong mint, peppermint kind of flavor, I think. Black tea, maybe even like an orange peel, I think makes sense. Now, when you taste it, you immediately get that quick sweetness. I'll call it the orange peel. It feels like orange peel. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's got kind of a fruit, a little bit of a fruit, but not a sweet fruit at all. It's got a hair of tartness And then as you drink it, then the rye opens up. The rye, you can feel that it's the spicy rye that opens up, especially towards the back of the mouth. Now, after I've taken that drink and I just kind of let it sit in there a minute, the sweetness kind of just stays on the backside of your throat. So it's a very easy drinking bourbon. It definitely tastes young, right? It tastes young. There's not a lot of meat to it, but it definitely is an easy drinking bourbon. And it's a good one to have in your hand if you're watching a game or if you're looking at stocks. It's a good one to have in your hand if you're looking at stocks. And primarily because it's not going to get you all up in arms. It's not going to drive you crazy. It's going to be a nice, smooth ride all the way to the finish. So remember, this is my recommendation. If you've got somebody coming over, they're new to bourbon, they're just getting started, they want some training wheels and some entry level. What Basil Hayden's does is it gives you that entry level, very accessible flavor without the big bite that's going to hit you from some of the others. So let's go ahead now and talk about what our stock might happen to be. And the reason that I picked this stock, and I picked IBM, because I'm trying to start, as we do these stocks on the rocks and we're taking a look at different stocks, I'm trying to pick some that investors have really found as their bellwethers, right? So let's talk about the story of IBM and really, what's their business like? How has their business changed recently? And then really talk a little bit about the fundamentals and what I always believe is most important, which are what are the technicals telling me about IBM. So think about IBM. IBM is they've been the big dog for years. You can go all the way back, and it's International Business Machines. IBM is a hardware producing fool. There are all these old pictures of IBMs and IBM, when they first started putting PCs and its mainframes, and you go all the way back to the roots of IBM, go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution in the 1880s. And you can follow the history, and it goes 1880s Industrial Revolution, it goes to processing machines, it goes to vacuum tube computers, it goes to punch cards. I mean, it's done. They've pretty much run the gamut, right? They've done everything from the world. But as technology has changed and evolved, IBM has had to as well. And recently, very recently, IBM had their largest acquisition in the history of the company, right? So essentially, this company has 140-year-old roots, and it was the largest acquisition in the history of the company, and it was the acquisition of Red Hat. Now, Red Hat is a cloud-based architectural computer architecture, right? So it's a lot more getting into the cloud. You see a lot of stuff coming out with what IBM does, but IBM now has to compete with things like Amazon, the AWS, or they've got to compete with Google, they've got to compete with Oracle. They've got all these cloud-based systems that they have to compete with, and what Red Hat does is it gives them the ability to compete. Now, I think that this was a big move and a strong move for IBM from the perspective that they are willing to go after a brand new core fundamental business model. But they took over Red Hat. Now, Red Hat was one of the cloud-based computing systems that was profitable. Not all of them are. Red Hat had found a way to make their systems profitable. So what IBM did, if you look at IBM from a pure fundamental standpoint, is that they had a fair amount of free cash flow. They still have a lot of free cash flow. And so they were able to utilize that free cash flow to secure the debt to take this $34 billion purchase, if you will, of Red Hat. Now, what that did from a fundamental standpoint is that IBM said, you know what, we're not going to do stock buybacks in 2020 or 2021. So they said that they're stopping their buybacks over 2020 and 2021 to be a little bit more conservative on the way that they keep their free cash flow. They want to make sure they've got everything lined up from a debt perspective, which I think is a smart move. I think that's a really smart move. I think what it does is it gives investors peace of mind that dividend yield that IBM pays is not going to get touched. Now, the dividend yield is something that investors really key in on. So IBM has a dividend yield somewhere in the realm of about 4 to 4.5%, depending on the price of IBM at the time. I think at the time we're recording, it's like 4.6. But IBM has a really strong yield, especially compared to what bonds are paying now, right? As we're seeing bond yields get sliced and sliced and sliced, I think that IBM's yield becomes that much more attractive, not just for individual investors, but also now for a lot more of the institutional-minded people. So keep an eye on IBM as a potential growth opportunity. I believe that IBM has some growth in its history or some growth in its future with what may be coming up. Now, the next thing to do is to talk about the technicals. And I'm going to put up a weekly chart, and I want you to take a look at this weekly chart that we have coming up. And what you're looking at here on this weekly chart is what's happened over the past 4 years or so. And IBM is sitting at about $140 a share, but we don't see a lot of strong directional movements one way or the other. We've been as high as about 210, as low as about 106. Now it's sitting at around $140 a share in this particular picture. But one of the things that we see is that we do see some consecutive higher lows. We're getting some consecutive higher lows. We've got 3 higher lows in a row. And we're starting to see that we do have a little bit of resistance right up here at the top. There are two swing highs right there at about 155, where we see the price has fallen from a couple of times. Now those 2 swing highs where prices come, that would be a resistance point. And for those of you that are new to technicals, resistance is like a ceiling. Think about hitting your head on a ceiling, right? Well, eventually, once that ceiling gets broken, the old ceiling will oftentimes become the new floor. And that's what I think can happen here in IBM. I think that if we see the market have overall bullish movement, then IBM, I think, will also, and that area that's resistance will act as a new floor. When we throw some moving averages on the chart, one of the things that we can see from a pure moving average perspective is that we've got this 50 period moving average, which is kind of intertwined with the 20 period moving average. And that's very common on a weekly chart when we see fairly sideways price action. But one of the things that I do find kind of interesting looking at these moving averages is that it is below the 200-week moving average. And it has kind of stayed below that for the last few months and maybe even the last year or so. It's stayed below that 200 period moving average, which is kind of telling. But notice that 200 period moving average is sitting right at about our level of resistance. So if price can break through there, it may act as a dynamic support level going forward. So zooming in a little bit and getting off of the weekly chart, let's take a look here at a daily chart. Okay, when we look at this daily chart, we can see that we have indeed rallied up, and price has rallied up over the last couple of days off of what could be a smaller time frame level of support. So I think that it's a decent opportunity from a bullish perspective to take a look at IBM. I think that there's a better chance for price to continue to rally over the next few months. I like the acquisition of Red Hat. I like the dividend yield, especially compared to what you can get everywhere else. And from a pure technical standpoint, we're seeing that we're coming up towards a resistance area, but that resistance area, I think, is something that can be punched through, that we may see an opportunity for price to rally a bit higher. Now, if you're wrong, maybe you place your stop just below $130 a share, somewhere in that range, just to protect yourself so that you don't take too big of a ride, because if it goes below 130, it could realistically go down to 110. A good opportunity in this is to look and see, where do I want to acquire? If I'm willing to acquire the stock, maybe it makes sense to sell puts as an acquisition strategy. And selling puts as an acquisition strategy is something that a lot of investors do as a way to defray some of the cost of just buying the stock. They can lower their cost basis by selling puts to acquire it. So if that's something you don't know about, feel free to go to tradersarmy.com. You can learn a bit more about, what are puts, how do options work, things like that. Hopefully it's something that can help you. So IBM, I think, is a fairly good stock. I'm actually pretty bullish on IBM over the next intermediate period to a long-term period. From a fundamental standpoint, it looks like it's fairly clean. Books are fairly clean. A little bit of an earnings per share weakness. I'm bullish on IBM. I'm bullish on Basil Hayden's, especially for newer bourbon drinkers. But newer investors, IBM's not a bad one to take a look at, especially with that dividend yield. Newer bourbon drinkers, Basil Hayden's really a good one. So cheers to you. See you next week.